Hello learners, welcome to this class. Today we are going to study a play called Our Town, and this was written by Thornton Niven Wilder. Thornton Niven Wilder was born on April 17th, 1897. He was an American playwright, a novelist. He won 3 Pulitzer Prizes for the novel Bridge on San Luis Rey and 2 for plays Our Town and The Skin of Our Teeth, and US National Book Award for his novel The Eighth Day. He was a student of the Oberlin College in Ohio, and then he attended the Yale University. He graduated in the year 1920. He spent a year in Rome. He took a job of teaching in a French prep school in New Jersey and started writing in his free time. He published his first novel in the year 1926, but he became famous when he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for The Bridge of San Luis Rey in 1927. The royalties of this novel allowed him to quit his teaching job, and he became a full-time writer. He became a literary celebrity and kept company with the likes of Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Gertrude Stein. In 1930s, however, Wilder came under attack from critics who branded him and his work as an escapist that refused to face the gloomy reality of the Depression. Hurt by this criticism and frustrated by the failure of his novel Heaven's My Destination, which he wrote in the year 1934, Wilder turned to writing his play Our Town, his most celebrated dramatic effort. It opened in Broadway in the year 1938 to rave reviews. Audiences appreciated the universality of the theme presented in the play, which enabled every theatre goer to participate in the action on the stage and identify with the characters. Our Town eventually won Wilder his second Pulitzer Prize and went on to become one of the most performed American plays of the 20th century. The first act of the play is also called as the daily life. Let us see what happens in this act. The play Our Town is introduced and narrated by the stage manager, who welcomes the audience to the fictional town of Grover's Corners in New Hampshire. It is early on May morning in the year 1901. The stage is largely empty. In the opening scene, except for some tables and chairs which represent the homes of the Gibbs and the Webb families, the setting of most of the action in Act 1. The set is sparse throughout the play. The activities of a typical day begin after the introduction given by the stage manager. Howie Newsome, who is the milkman, Joe Crowell Jr., the paper boy, make their rounds of delivery. Dr. Gibbs returns after delivering a set of twins at one of the homes in the towns. Mrs. Gibbs and Mrs. Webb make breakfast and send their children off to school. After school, George and Emily Webb exchange a few words, and Emily asks her mother if she is pretty. Mrs. Gibbs and Mrs. Webb meet in their gardens to gossip and also discuss their modest ambitions. Mrs. Gibbs reveals that she longs to visit Paris. The stage manager interrupts this action of theirs. He calls Professor Willard and Mr. Webb onto the stage to tell the audience some basic facts about Grover's Corners. Mr. Webb not only talks to the audience, but also asks some questions from the audience who are actually characters in the play who are seated amongst the audience. Afternoon arrives, schools let out. George and Emily, who are neighbors, they meet outside her gate. We see the first hint of George and Emily's romantic affection for one another during this scene. And during Emily's subsequent conversation with her mother, where she asks if she is pretty enough. The stage manager thanks and he dismisses Emily and Mrs. Webb. He then launches into a discussion of a time capsule that will be placed in the foundation of a new bank building in the town. He tells us that he wishes to put the copy of this play, Our Town, into this time capsule. Now it is evening. A choir in the orchestra pit begins to sing, "Blessed be the tie that binds." The choir is directed by a comical choir master, Simon Stimeson. He continues to sing as George and Emily talk to each other through open windows about their homework. Mrs. Webb and Mrs. Gibbs and their gossipy friend Mrs. Soames return home from the choir practice and talk about the choir master's alcoholism and return to their respective homes. George and his sister sit at the window and look outside. Rebecca ponders over the position of Grover Corners within the vastness of the universe, which she believes is contained within the mind of God. The first act comes to an end. Let us analyze the act. As suggested in the title, Our Town is a play about a typical American town. The stage manager tells the audience that they are looking at Grover's Corners, New Hampshire, but they get a feeling that it can be any small American town. The introduction itself, the stage manager establishes a familiarity between the world on stage and the world off stage. The stage manager interacts directly to the audience as if the audience is people passing through the town rather than distant, disconnected theatre goers. The action in this act does not circle around any remarkable incident, but rather serves to create a sense of town's atmosphere and the disposition of the townspeople. Moreover, Wilder's presentation of the morning activities of the two families gives the audience an insight into what the town people's lives look like, not just on this morning, but perhaps on every morning. The Gibbses and the Webbs represent two conventional American families, just as Grover's Corner represents a typical small American town. The two family homes are the only homes into which the audience are allowed to see. They see other characters such as Howie Newsom and Joe Crowell Jr. only as fleeting figures projected against the lives of Gibbs and the Webbs. Dr. Gibbs and the paper boy chat about the wedding of the local school teacher. The children speak about schoolwork and their allowances, and Mrs. Gibbs talks about her lifelong yearning to take a vacation in Europe. The play focuses on the characters rather than on a dramatic action in order to protect this sense of universal applicability. The hopes, dreams, and morning rituals of the townspeople we meet are characteristic of the people all over the world. Therefore, it is universal. Act 2 takes place 3 years later. It is George and Emily's wedding day. It is a day filled with stress. George tries to visit his fiancée, but he is shooed away by Mr. and Mrs. Webb, who tell him that it is bad luck for the groom to see the bride on the wedding day any time before the ceremony. Mrs. Webb goes upstairs to make sure that Emily does not come downstairs to meet George. George is left alone with Mr. Webb. The young man and the future father-in-law awkwardly discuss marriage and how a good and virtuous husband should be. The stage manager suddenly interrupts and introduces a flashback to the audience. He goes to the previous year where George and Emily are on their way home from school. George has just been elected the president of the class and Emily has just been elected secretary and treasurer. George has become a local baseball star. Emily accuses George that his popularity has made him conceited and stuck up. George is hurt but thanks Emily for her honesty. But Emily becomes shamed at her own words and asks George to forget them. The two stop at Mr. Morgan's drugstore for ice cream and sodas. Over the drink, they admit their mutual love. George decides to abandon his plan of attending agriculture school in favor of staying in Grover's Corners with Emily. We return to the day of the wedding in 1904. The wedding follows where George is in a fit of nervousness, tells his mother that he is not ready to marry. Both the bride and the groom feel jittery, but their parents calm them and the ceremony goes ahead as planned. The stage manager also acts as a clergyman. The newlyweds run out through the audience and the second act ends with the stage manager's announcement that it is time for another interval. Let us analyze this act. The direct address of Professor Willard and Mr. Webb to the audience serves several purposes. The stage manager requests the two men to appear on stage and speak. This indicates his almost godlike authority on the play. He appears to control everything that happens on stage, stopping the action at will, pulling characters away from their everyday activities to communicate with the audience and asking them to depart from the stage when their presence is no longer required. Professor Willard's and Mr. Webb's report, as well as Mr. Webb's conversation with the audience, strengthen the bond between the characters and the audience. In this way, the audience feel included in the daily life of Grover's Corners. Through the stage manager's omniscient knowledge of the town's events and his foresight of the characters' deaths, Wilder implies that an exact understanding of the town comes not only from meeting its current inhabitants, but also from knowing its history. Finally, the audience understands how remarkably commonplace the town is and how culturally, ethnically, religiously and politically homogeneous. Professor Willard's geological references entail that very little has changed throughout history of Grover's Corners. Additionally, Stage manager foreshadows the fact that the play deals with both marriage, death, before the evening ends, when he says the play details the marrying, living and dying of the inhabitants of Grover's Corners. Regardless of the town people's well-meaning nature, they have only a limited ability or enthusiasm to act or confront societal problems. For example, Mr. Webb and Constable Warren simply watch Mr. Stimpson walk by in a drunken haze. Mr. Webb offers to walk with Mr. Stimpson, but does not press the matter beyond the realm of polite interaction. There is a sense that though isolated, Grover's Corners is inextricably bound to the rest of the world and its accompanying problems. The residents of our town clearly have faults, but we recognize these faults as our own and take them to heart. Next, Wilder addresses the query of our town's cultural significance in the stage manager's conversation of the time capsule. In addition to the vital cultural and political artifacts that are deposited in the time capsule, the Bible, the work of Shakespeare, the Constitution, the stage manager desires to include this play. The rationale of a time capsule is to give people in the future a precise idea of what it was like to live in the previous time. Our town will serve an unexpected purpose. When the town capsule is opened, it will show people 1,000 years from now the way we were in our growing up, in our marrying and in our living and in our dying. Wilder intends for his play not only to entertain but also to inform its audiences. In showing ordinary life in a small town, the play becomes appropriate to the human desire to know the details of human history. The stage manager opens the act this time with a very lengthy monologue. He emphasizes eternity and takes the audience to the cemetery outside the town and the characters who died in the 9 years since Act 2. Mrs. Gibbs, who died of pneumonia while travelling. Wally Webb died because of a burst appendix while camping. Mrs. Soames, Simon Stimpson committed suicide by hanging themselves, and Emily, who died giving birth to her and George's second child. Therefore, Act 3 takes place after 9 years in a cemetery on a hilltop overlooking the town. The funeral party occupies the back of the stage. The most prominent characters in this act are the dead souls already inhabit the cemetery. They sit in the chairs at the front of the stage. Among the dead are Mrs. Gibbs, Mrs. Soames, Wally Webb, Simon Stimpson. As the funeral takes place, the dead start speaking. They are detached witnesses. Death has made them indifferent to earthly events. Emily also joins the dead, but she misses her previous life and decides to go back and relive a part of it. The other souls disapprove and advise Emily to stay in the cemetery. With the help of the stage manager, Emily steps into the past. She revisits the morning of her 12th birthday. Howie Newsom, Joe Crowell Jr. make their deliveries of newspaper and milk as usual. Mrs. Webb gives her daughter some presents and calls Mr. Webb. As Emily participates and also watches the scene as an outsider and as an observer, she notices the youth and beauty of her parents. Emily now appreciates small things of everyday life, and her parents and other living characters do not share that feeling. She gets agonized by the beauty and transience of everyday life and wants to be taken back to the cemetery. As Emily settles in among the dead souls, George lays prostrate next to her tomb. They don't understand, she says of the living. The stars come out of Grover's corners and the play ends. Let us analyze the third act. The likeness between the morning activities in Act 1 and Act 2 shows that an underlying constancy defines life in Grover's Corners. Despite the commencement of marriage and other indications of individual growth and maturation, even though the stage manager says that several years have passed since Act 1, very little in the town seems to have changed. Howie Newsom still delivers milk. A member of the Crowell family still delivers the newspaper. The train whistle still blows at 5:45 a.m. every morning. The stage manager's explanation of the passing of time tells about the difference between individual change and the broader change. At an individual level, babies that weren't even born before have become talking regular sentences already. On a more general level, the stage manager comments on the slow shifts of geology, saying that the weather and the erosion have gradually worn out the mountains. The suns come up over 1,000 times, but natural and environmental forces remain cyclical and steadfast. The stage manager uses the technique of flashbacks to add the sense of general permanence in the play. Here he uses the technique of flashback to actually slow the time. He interrupts George and Emily's wedding day and returns to the moment at which the romantic friendship begins. In this case, the flashback offers a relationship between the two scenes that emphasizes the play's focus on stability. Emily and George's anxiety at the drugstore opposes their wedding day jitters. Although the idea of wedding suggests the two young people should be matured, but Emily and George remain childlike and anxious. Comforting their children, the parents demonstrate the constancy of the dynamic relationship between a parent and the child. This relationship of thematically similar but temperamentally separate scenes implies past, present and future all bear a striking resemblance to each other. The association between George and Emily comprises the central narrative of the play. Wilder traces the development of George and Emily's love from initial neighborly friendliness to later romantic affection and marriage, and ultimately to the grief over the loss of a loved one, with its rather general emotions and ritual. Emily and George's relationship is representative of a broad gamut of relationships in the play, including those of Dr. and Mrs. Gibbs, Mr. and Mrs. Webb, but it is the only relationship the audience sees in its entirety from start to the finish. Wilder was very dissatisfied with the theatre of his time. He felt that something had gone wrong, and he felt that the theatre was not only inadequate but it was also evasive. To overcome this inadequacy, his response was to use a meta-theatrical style. Our town's narrator, who is the stage manager, is completely aware of his relationship with the audience and could address them directly. According to the script, the play can be performed with very little scenery, no set and minimal props. The characters mime the objects with which they interact. Their surroundings are created only with chairs, tables, staircases and ladders. For example, in Act 1, the scene in which Emily helps George with his evening homework, she converses through the upstairs windows. This conversation is performed with the two actors standing atop two separate ladders which represent neighboring houses. Throughout the play, we see the characters pantomime their activities and chores. For example, when Howie delivers milk, no horse appears on the stage despite the fact that he frequently addresses his horse Bessie. Howie does not hold anything in his hands, but he pantomimes as if he is carrying milk bottles, and the sound of clinking milk bottles comes from off stage. This deliberate abandonment of props goes hand in hand with the minimal set. Our Town in many ways is Wilder's response to his critics, American writers of the time like Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology and Sherwood Anderson, Winnisburg, Ohio, analyzed and exposed the buried secrets, hypocrisy and oppression present beneath the surface of the American small town life. In the play Our Town, however, Wilder presents a far happier picture of a small town. It is a fictional hamlet of Grover's Corners in New Hampshire. Wilder is aware of the fact that the town suffers from social injustice and hypocrisy. Neither does he intend to idealize Grover's Corners as a bastion of uncompromising brotherly love. On the contrary, Wilder makes his characters criticize small town life and Grover Corners specifically. On the other hand, however, Wilder does denounce the community simply because it contains strains of hypocrisy. Instead, he searches into Grover's Corners in order to find lessons about life in a world that contains both virtue and vice. He effectively tracks the residents' day-to-day activities, their triumphs and their tribulations, their casual conversations, their formal traditions. This he does not because he wants to praise New Hampshire, but because he wants to praise humanity. Our Town is the study of human life and its complexities. Wilder's most important message in Our Town is that people should appreciate and enjoy life. Every detail and every interaction of everyday life while they live them. This was very important aspect, especially in a critical time when political troubles were escalating in Europe. World War II was just around the corner when the play hit the theatres in the year 1938. It was a time of great deal of international tension and fear. Citizens around the world suffered from fear and uncertainty. Under these conditions, Our Town directed attention away from the negative aspects of life prevalent in the late 30s and focused on the aspects of the day-to-day human experience that make life precious. Wilder emphasized his faith in the stability and constancy of life through his depiction of small town Grover's Corners with his marrying, living and dying. The 1920s and 1930s proved to be the best of Wilder's career. He also enlisted himself as a soldier and served in Europe during World War II. And though he continued his literary career after he returned to the United States, his literary output decreased in the next 2 decades. Much later, his book, The Eighth Day, which was written in the year 1967, got mixed reviews. Wilder died in December 1975 at his home in Connecticut. I hope you have all understood the play Our Town, written by Thornton Wilder. In this lesson, in this class, I have taught you the play. In the next class, let us understand the characters, the themes, the motives and the symbols of the play. Meet you in the next class. Thank you.